Good afternoon, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the ISAS-SPF book discussion after Tiananmen, the rise of China. Today, we are delighted to have with us as the guest speaker, Mr. Vijay Gokhale, former Foreign Secretary of India and non-resident senior fellow, Carnegie, India. I shall now invite ISAS Director, Associate Professor Iqbal Singh Sevia, to deliver the welcome remarks and chair the session with Mr. Gokhale. Professor Sevia, please.
Thanks, Shavina. Good afternoon, Mr. Vijay Gokhale. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, both those who are present here and those who are viewing us on live streaming as well. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, Japan, I welcome you to this afternoon's ISAS-SPF book discussion on After Tiananmen, the Rise of China. We're delighted to have with us today Mr. Vijay Gokhale to discuss his latest book, After Tiananmen, the Rise of China. Mr. Gokhale is a distinguished diplomat, intellectual, and author who has spent decades working on and in China. I would dare say he's one of the most authoritative thinkers on China in India. While there's a fair amount of literature on India and China relations, Mr. Gokhale is one of the few who has been able to take a deep dive into the internal developments in China itself. And his new book, I'm not sure if he positions it as a sequel to his two previous books on China, but if not a sequel, then it definitely takes the analysis further. And we're getting closer to the next point, so I'm curious about what the next book project is about. After Tiananmen, for those who have got a chance to have a look at the book, or I highly recommend it, it's a book that moves beyond broad strokes to present a textured and contextualized analysis of socio-political, economic, foreign policy, and strategic developments in China after 1989. I was particularly impressed by the way it questions the presentation of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, as a monolithic organization and highlights instead the development, negotiation, and in some ways contestations of policies as well. And I'm sure we'll hear more about this in the talk. The book also presents important ways and perspectives on how to think about the evolution in China's relationship with India. Now, I'm very sure that Mr. Gokhale doesn't really need an introduction, but for formality purposes and for those of us who may not know all of his accomplishments, I'd like to just give you a brief intro to Mr. Gokhale. Mr. Gokhale is a non-resident senior fellow at Carnegie, India. He retired from the Indian Foreign Service in January 2020 after a diplomatic career that spanned 39 years. From January 2018 to January 2020, he served as the Foreign Secretary of India. Prior to this, he served as India's High Commissioner to Malaysia and Germany and as India's ambassador to China. During his time in the headquarters of the Ministry of External Affairs, he also worked in key positions in the East Asian Division, including Joint Secretary, Director General of East Asia. Mr. Gokhale has worked extensively on matters relating to the Indo-Pacific region with a special emphasis on Chinese politics and diplomacy. Since his retirement, he writes for a number of newspapers, both India and international. These include the New York Times, Foreign Policy, Times of India, The Hindu, the Indian Express. And this, as I mentioned, is his third book on China. And Mr. Gokhale has also been a distinguished faculty at the Symbiosis International University in Pune since January 2021. He received his master's degree in history from the University of Delhi in 1980, and he studied Mandarin at the Chinese University of Hong Kong from 1983 to 1984. It's indeed my honor to hand the floor over to Mr. Gokhale, and after the talk, we will have question and answer session. I'm looking forward to that too. So, Mr. Gokhale, please.
Thank you, Professor Sevia. I want to thank the Institute for South Asian Studies and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation for inviting me to present my new book. And before I speak about the book, I do want to briefly touch upon why I wrote this book. Of course, a majority of my public service before it ended in January 2020 was in China and on China. And therefore, that this was obviously a subject that I was both professionally and personally interested in. But in the course of my sort of 4-decade-long career, there was increasingly a sense that Indians did not have enough information and fact-based analysis about China. The public discourse was and continues to be, in my opinion, both superficial and prejudicial. Superficial because it was episodic. It is episodic. Whenever there is an incident, there is a lot of information on that incident, but it is rarely fact-based or well-researched. And prejudicial because either we sensationalize the news or we glorify China to the extent that it leaves us with the impression that as Indians we might never be able to catch up with China. And therefore, I think that the public discourse needs to be improved with the availability of analytical-based perspectives on China. Now, in the absence, of course, of such work, we tend to look at Western perspectives. And there is no doubt that Western perspectives are very well analyzed, very well researched. Some of the most outstanding experts on China are Western. But I often ask myself whether Western perspectives should shape the approach of Indians and more broadly of people in the region, including people in Southeast Asia, on China. Because our circumstances are different. Let's start with geography. We are proximate or near proximate neighbors to the People's Republic of China, whereas the West is separated by continents and oceans. Economically, we are at a different level from that of the West. Socially, culturally, we are organized differently. Politically, we don't necessarily share the same sort of systems that the West has. And therefore, I think it is important to develop an Indian perspective, or more broadly speaking, an Asian perspective on China, if we are to move ahead. And just as a matter of example, I was in Boston for a conference last month, and the debate in the United States within the strategic community was whether China is still rising or has it peaked? Is it a peaking China? In other words, China has reached the level it could reach and will either be able to just maintain that or go into a slow decline. Now, this is, of course, a debate we should all be interested in, and I can see the validity of this debate in the West. But as far as we are concerned, we also need to be aware that whether it is going to still rise or whether it has peaked, it is still an $18 trillion economy with a very large military capacity and a very large diplomatic influence. And therefore, we have to also, while of course debating whether it's rising or peaking, in my opinion, give greater salience to seeing how we can manage our relationship with China in such a way that we maximize the opportunities and minimize the risk. And I think that is why an Indian perspective is important. My first book, Tiananmen Square, The Making of a Protest, essentially came out of the fact that I was in Beijing during that period, and I always wanted to write about it, but because of my career, I couldn't. And after leaving public service, I could, so I did write about it. But this is a seminal event in Chinese politics. It resonates even today. It has shaped the way China has developed after 1990. And even today, if there is one defining moment in contemporary Chinese politics, it is the incident of 1989. In my book, I try to argue that this was not a movement for democracy, as some of the Western perspectives put it. It was a much more complex set of circumstances. There were underlying economic causes, high inflation, lack of jobs, and so on. To some extent, it was very party political. There was factionalism within the Communist Party between those who wanted to open and reform and those who wanted to shut down the system and go back to a more Maoist version of economics and politics. To some extent, I believe it was also because the relative freedoms that were given to the people after the great proletarian cultural revolution was over may have led to some sort of public airing of dissatisfaction. Be that as it may, the subsequent crackdown that occurred, the reimposition of authority, reinforced the fact that the party is central to the understanding the People's Republic of China. And we very often forget that this is not a normal country. It is a country where the party has taken all the institutions of the state to serve its interests of survival and continuance in power, which is very different from most of the other countries in the region, which are democracies where the constitution and the state are separate from the political parties which may or may not form a government. My second book is, in a sense, both a sequel and not a sequel, because whereas the first one dealt with, or it revolved around a seminal event in Chinese politics, the second one is more, it covers a broader period from 1990 to 2010. And it is organized thematically, and more importantly, I try to relate certain stories or anecdotes, because my objective is to allow the common person to read the book. It is not something that is meant for the academic community. It is, I hope, meant for ordinary people who might want to know more about China. And as you said, there is relatively little writing on China proper in India. And the central message of this book, this second book, is that that the rise of China, when we say China has risen, that rise took place between the period that Deng Xiaoping moved away from active politics and the rise of Xi Jinping as the leader of China. And let me sort of give an example of how this is akin to the period of the High Qing Empire. You had two emperors, the emperors Kangxi and Qianlong, each of whom ruled for 60 years. And that period is known as the Kangqian prosperous period. But we forget that between these two reigns, there was a third emperor, Yongzheng. He reigned for just 13 years, but in those 13 years, the sort of administrative changes, political centralization, the social changes, the military changes that he introduced allowed the Emperor Qianlong to take China to the greatest heights that it did achieve during the Qing Empire. And I relate the period 1990 to 2010 very much to that. It appeared as if you had an era of Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, which was a sort of holding pattern. But in fact, it was the most productive period in the history of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think we tend to treat both periods, the period of the Yongzheng Emperor and the period of Jiang Hu General Secretaryship, as an interregnum. Whereas we need to study both these periods to understand what were the factors that allowed China to rise. Because really during the Jiang Hu period, you had economic growth which was consistently over 10% per annum. You had technological advances. You had it is under Hu Jintao that the basis of military modernization was laid, including the military industrial complex, and you had great successes in foreign policy. Now, the two key pillars which I believe allowed for this rise after 1990 were that the party and the leadership were willing to take political risk. And secondly, there was a relative relaxation of authoritarian control during this particular period. And let me explain why I see these two as the sort of core elements to explain the rise of China. We all talk of Deng Xiaoping's southern tour, his Nanxun in 1992, and how it helped put reform and opening up back on track. I think that itself is an important political risk that the leadership took, because after the Tiananmen incident, it would be axiomatic that the leadership would double down and reverse reform and opening up so that stability could be restored and control of the party was not diluted. And yet Deng and other people pushed reform and opening up, struggled with the sort of leftist members of the Communist Party, eventually prevailed, and reform and opening up was put on track after that. Now, this allowed for decentralization of leadership within China. Power flowed out of the Secretariat and the Politburo to the provinces, and from the provinces to the counties and the districts. And it also allowed for competitiveness to grow, competition between the provinces, between the counties, and so on and so forth. And this was a high-risk strategy. I think that is the central element in this book, because there were no precedents. These were uncharted waters. There was no prior experience to go upon. There were no managerial talents which could manage this sort of change, because the People's Republic of China, like India, had grown up in the Cold War. So there were no precedents that the Chinese could refer to, either in terms of economic reform or political reform or diplomatic and national security policy. And it was high risk because in a democracy, when leaders take political risk, you risk the loss of power because you don't win in the next general election. But in China, when you take political risk, you not only, if you fail, you not only lose political power, but you lose personal freedom at times. And we have Chao Ziyang as the obvious example of that. And you are also possibly likely to lose your life, as we have seen during the Cultural Revolution with people like Liu Shaoqi or Peng Dehuai or Chen Yi or a host of other leaders who were on the wrong side of the political equation at that time. So I think when we tend to think that it is easier to take decisions in an authoritarian system than it is in democracies, but I think we also tend to forget that the risk is much, much higher. And in this case, the Chinese leadership took those risks and saw through the reforms. Now, it was a risk because they never knew whether by reforming the public sector, the state-owned enterprises, or by breaking up the welfare system, the Iron Rice Bowl as it was called, they would again create the social instability which led to 1989. So in a sense, a lot of political and ideological preparation went into those reforms which the party executed, which the leadership under Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao executed, and it was very largely responsible for that spectacular economic growth that we all saw and certainly this part of the world benefits from. The second important point I make in the book is that it was not just the political risk the leadership took, but the relative relaxation of authoritarian controls, which allowed for an explosion of art, of science, of ideas, of innovation, of entrepreneurship in China. Now, I'm not for a minute suggesting that all of a sudden China became a free country. But because we know that the party remains in control, it retained all the levers of power, it regulated the freedoms that could be permitted. But if you compare it to the period before and the current period, then those 20 years were a time in China when there was a stepping back of the party from governance, so that the state council and the governors of states, as distinct from the Politburo and the party secretary, started administering and taking policy decisions. This was also a time when the public sector was divested and when a non-state sector came into being, and constitutionally that non-state sector was protected. This was also the time when new elites were co-opted into the Communist Party. This was not a worker, peasant, soldier party anymore. You had students who were co-opted, you had intellectuals, academics, members of the strategic community, and you had business people. For different reasons, they were co-opted. But the result was an expansion of the political base of the party, so that you did not have important elements of society or economy of politics outside the party, and therefore potentially able to create a problem. The intellectual world was certainly regulated, but it was a relatively free system where Chinese scholars, researchers, scientists could have interaction with the West quite openly. And anecdotally, I can say that when I was in Beijing between 1997 and 2000, it was much easier to meet Chinese academics, to go to Chinese universities, to talk to Chinese intellectuals than it was when I returned in 2016 and 17. By that time, you required prior permission, you had to send written requests, and very often you may not have been able to meet the people you wanted to meet. So while intellectual discourse was regulated, a lot of the discourse was allowed and permitted and in fact encouraged by the state. And finally, of course, in terms of foreign and national security policy, there was a general sense that debate was possible. This was a period, as I explained in my book, when Deng Xiaoping's whole foreign policy approach of Tao Guang Yang Hui, or hide your capabilities and bide your time, was coming under some sort of questioning. And that was inevitable because as China's economy grew, as it needed resources, it needed energy, it had markets abroad, it needed to secure the sea lanes of communication. The foreign and national security policy had to address all these issues. And therefore, the whole debate was whether the policy of Tao Guang Yang Hui was valid any longer. And you had various experiments with words like peaceful rise, peaceful development, harmonious world, an effort to find language and rhetoric which could allow Chinese foreign and national security policy to evolve. And therefore, I think that a combination of the risk that the leadership took and the relative relaxation of authoritative controls that it allowed really incubated this whole economic growth that we saw in China. And and to the point where by the global financial crisis, China in fact became the engine that pulled the world out of what was a crisis probably as severe as the 1930s depression in the West. Now, the book also, of course, talks of the downstream effects of the Chiang Hu period, because it wasn't all positive territory. You had massive corruption, and perhaps the best book I have read on this is by a Singaporean American. Her name is Yuan Ang, and her book, her recent book really talks about how this corruption spread through the system, how it was initially good for the system and eventually became a problem for the political system. You had a weakening of ideology. It was very difficult by 2010 to actually believe that China was communist, because the income disparities, the regional disparities, even the digital disparity was growing between the rural and between the hinterland and the coast, between the rich upper class and the working class, and so on and so forth. You had increasing factionalism in the party, because power had flowed out of the General Secretary and the Politburo Standing Committee to a whole set of actors. The military was virtually autonomous. The public security organs did not necessarily toe the line. You had large businesses which had emerged, the Alibabas and the Tencents and the Peitus, which could in a sense had the resources to become politically active. You had a lot of questioning of the party itself. So you had factionalism within the party, and that factionalism was based on money politics. The old Quanxi system, where your father or your mother had worked with a particular leader, and therefore you had family ties or military ties or regional ties, was now replaced by money politics. And that was a problem. And of course, then you had the rise of nationalism and ultra-nationalism in China. So there were certain downstream effects. And I conclude really just before the current leader takes over. And one of my conclusions is, of course, that a number of actions that President Xi Jinping took in the early years is also explained by the downstream impact of China's reforms, the negative aspects of China's reforms, as well as the fact that the positive aspects had sort of peaked by the global financial crisis, and perhaps a change of situation is required. I hope that I can write the third part of the trilogy, because it is intended to be a trilogy, and that part would cover 2012 to 2022, which is essentially the current era. And I'm currently sort of trying to gather material on that. And again, the basic hypothesis I am going to, or the basic question I am asking, is whether we have seen a reversal of these two key drivers, which is the willingness to take political risk to take the Chinese economy to the next level, and the willingness to relatively relax authoritarian controls to allow for free movement of ideas. Has this process been stalled or reversed under the current leadership? I mean, I won't go into too much of detail, but I do want to just conclude with a few points that I want to make regarding the current sort of leadership, and I'd be happy to answer questions on that. Firstly, I think that a comparison of President Xi Jinping with any of his predecessors may not be the best way to go about it. Certainly, Xi Jinping is not Mao Zedong. I think Mao Zedong very much reveled in chaos. Xi Jinping is a person who believes in order, politically, socially, in terms of stability. Certainly, Xi Jinping is not Deng Xiaoping, because Deng, to a certain degree, wanted to move away from the personality cult or personalized leadership to having certain norms, political norms, norms for succession, age norms, term limits, and so on. As we have seen, President Xi Jinping has done away with much of what Deng put into position in 1980 when he issued the guidelines for political life in the party. And certainly, as Xi Jinping himself has said in the speech at the 20th Party Congress, he isn't Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, because he described it as weak, hollowed out, watered down leadership. And I think that's fairly clear whom he was referring to when he said that. We also know that a much more legal security approach has been adopted for discipline in the party. We also know that the anti-corruption campaign is being used for political objectives. There is almost no alternative thinking anymore. The people are expected to align with Xi Jinping thought. There is thought unity in a sense. Questioning this might be problematic. And finally, there is the securitization of the state. In other words, even the economy and interact and diplomacy are becoming, in a sense, securitized. So again, this is something that needs to be sort of studied. But at least my new book would, at this point of time, sort of question whether what I thought or what I think are the drivers for growth in the period between 1990 and 2010, are these being reversed? And is that going to have an impact on the way China grows after 2012? Or did they just run their course, and did the current leader have no other option but to continue on a new, to chart a new course? Because certainly what we are seeing is a very new course in terms of phrases like dual circulation, common prosperity, and even on diplomacy and foreign policy, where recent pronouncements talk of a turbulent world and choppy waters and a huge challenge that China faces in the international arena. So really, this will be the subject of my last book in this trilogy. And my fervent hope is that others in India and in our part of the world, that is the Indo-Pacific, write more about China, sort of fact-based analysis, but not necessarily academic, because academic works become difficult to read for ordinary people. And therefore, it has to be written in a way which is understandable and which is interesting. And I hope this happens, because there is far too much at stake for all of us, in those who live in the Indo-Pacific. As it becomes more and more important, as it returns to being the center of the world, which it was until 1800, we cannot continue without understanding the country which will be the largest economy in the region, which will have enormous military power, irrespective of whether it is rising or peaking, and a country which has a different political system, a different outlook to ours, and we have to still manage our relationship and, as I said, maximize our opportunities and minimize our risks. So if you agree, I will stop here, Professor Sevia, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Gokhale, for that very interesting introduction to the book. I'm sure many of us are waiting to get your hands on it. I have, so I highly encourage the rest of you. I think in some ways you preempted some of the questions that are going to be asked as well. But before I open the floor, maybe I'll just ask, as you can see, I have a list of things I wanted to go through. But with two broad sort of questions, just to start the ball rolling in a sense. One is the sense I got from when looking through the book and from your talk is that while many have proposed that the changes, at least in the foreign policy sector, are linked to Xi Jinping's own ideological formulations, the sense I get from your work is that it's actually a sort of historical development of it's sort of coming to culmination of certain forces that have been pre-existing. And so I'd like to get your sense on that. But linked to that is also another thing I'm very curious to hear from you about is from Deng, Hu Jintao, Xi Jinping, there's also, apart from the economic policies and the preparation, as you point out, the political and economic preparation, intellectual preparation, there also seems to be a different understanding of the role of the state and of governance as well. So I'd like to hear a little more about from you about those two issues.
Sure. Thank you. On the foreign policy bit, I mean, initially I also felt the same, in that I thought that President Xi Jinping, when he assumed office as General Secretary in 2012, started a new phase of foreign policy. But when I began to research the period between 2005 and 2010, I actually came up with a huge number of Chinese sources, including such eminent experts as Wang Qise and Yan Xuetong and people of that caliber, who were talking about whether the Tao Guang Yang Hui or hide your capabilities and bide your time was actually serving China's interests any longer. Because by then, of course, China's economy was reaching $7 or $8 trillion. It had overtaken Germany as the largest exporter in the world, and it was hugely dependent on resources from abroad. And therefore, the question arose as to whether the foreign policy that it had could protect these vital interests, because if they were not protected, it would have an impact on GDP growth numbers. And therefore, I saw a debate in the Chinese strategic community among the major think tanks about the suitability of staying with Deng's advice or moving to a new one. And in a sense, I think a major, either a speech or a piece of writing that Tai Ping-guo, who was then the state councillor and therefore the senior most foreign policy expert in the government and party, if you will, he had written a piece at which he closed the debate, in a sense, and said we need to stick with Deng Xiaoping's Tao Guang Yang Hui. So I think that ferment within the strategic community had begun. Now, it's interesting that it began, of course, at a time when Xi Jinping himself came to central politics, because until 2007, he was not in Beijing. He came when he was appointed to the Politburo Standing Committee in October 2007. So he must have been a part of this discussion. And presumably his own ideas may have undergone change, or he may have brought the idea that Tao Guang Yang Hui wasn't going to work. So the point is that a lot of the debate that took place was subsequently implemented under him. It was organized as policy under him, but the discussion had begun much earlier. And I would hazard the guess that if, hypothetically speaking, he had not become the leader, let us say Li Keqiang had become the general secretary, or some third person had become the general secretary, arguably China may still have abandoned the the Deng policy of Thao Quang Yanghui and moved on to something else. As far as the governance issue is concerned, I think we need to be clear that the party's centrality has never gone. Whether it is Mao, Deng, or Xi, or anybody in between, the party remains central to all power in the People's Republic of China. But I think that the experiences of the Maoist period were so debilitating for the country and its leadership that Deng put into place a set of principles which he hoped would prevent a personality cult from emerging again. And the idea was to ensure that the leadership was constrained by certain checks and balances in a way that we do constitutionally in democracy, Singapore and India. But in that case, since the party and the state are the same, it was the party which was doing the putting the boundaries, whereas in the case of democracies, it is the state and the constitution which does so. And therefore, the term limits and the distribution of power within the Politburo Standing Committee, the efforts to separate the military from politics by not allowing military people to be appointed to the Politburo Standing Committee after 1997, these were all part of Deng's plan. Of course, perhaps the rest of the world assumed that Deng had transformed the country to such a degree that politics would not go back to what it was in Mao's period. But as we have seen from what happened in 2012, the Po Xilai incident and subsequently Xi Jinping's own actions, that perhaps Deng's reforms were not as deeply rooted as we thought. And what we are seeing again is a revival of the personality cult and centralization of power again. But nonetheless, I think we should not assume that Deng, Chiang, or Hu were, in a sense, changing the party. There was no intention to do so. They were all unanimous in the view that the party will continue forever. It's, I think, the methods that they had adopted, because Deng believed that if those controls were not put in place, you could well descend into the kind of cultural revolution chaos that had happened, and this time the party might not survive. They were lucky to survive the last time. So we have to see where President Xi Jinping takes this. But ultimately, I think there's not much of a difference between what Deng was doing and what Xi is doing, except in certain modalities. The end objective is the same.
Thank you. The floor is open. Could I just request that you introduce yourself before you ask your question? Thank you.
Thanks so much. So you painted a picture of, where China went politically, economically, foreign policy-wise, onwards 1989, and even, till the contemporary time. If I need to ask you, how was India responding? If there has to be a graph of China's internal, dynamics, how was India responding in that, if you could paint that graph? Because it's a very interesting timeline. 1989 is also when Rajiv Gandhi resets, India-China relations. It's also interesting when you say that some of these most assertive elements in Chinese foreign policy and security policy were evident even before Xi Jinping actually took charge. And you see a lot happening on the border in early 2000s in a sense. But also when under Deng and later under Hu Jintao, you also see that India and China in that interim period kind of developing an economic interdependent relationship, the CBMs and all that. So it's a very nice complement if you could kind of give a broad overview of how India was responding to what was happening in China, but also the India-China relations and how they correspond to, the timelines of your book.
Yeah. I think the end of the Cold War was a difficult time for both India and China. In a sense, we were both born in the Cold War. We did not have any experience of managing international relations beyond the Cold War. And so for both of us, it was an experiment. There were also compulsions on both sides. From the Indian side, the compulsion was that the West had normalized relations with China. And after Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union, the Soviets started indicating the same. So there was some amount of pressure on India, if we were not to be completely isolated, to also improve relations with China. But equally, there was pressure on the Chinese side because the Tiananmen incident had led to some amount of Western pressure on China and sanctions. Besides, China was now facing a unipolar world where after the Soviet Union disintegrated, the target was painted on China. It was the largest communist state. So to that extent, it saw India as sharing its view that we need a new international political and economic order where multipolarity should be the ultimate objective and where we could work together to ensure that unipolarity did not cause either of us great damage or harm. So there were compulsions on both sides. But ironically, what happened after 1990 was that we moved away from each other in the sense that our focus, both India's and China's, was reform and opening up. China opened 10 years before us. We opened up only in 1991 under Prime Minister Narasimha Rao. But opening up required money, technology, and talent. And all this was only found in the West. So China looked westward. We also looked westward. And one of the consequences of that was a sharp fall in high-quality scholarship in India about China and in China about India. And I can say this with some confidence because I had, of course, worked in China between 1988 and 91, and then I came back in 97 and stayed till 2000. And I saw the focus of strategic and academic community shifting away from India. India fell very low in their priorities. And there was, whereas there were real experts on South Asia or India in 1988, by 2000, it was difficult to find young Chinese who were excited about studying India. They were into the United States, Japan, the West. If China's interest dictated it, they were interested in the energy producing areas, the Gulf, or the mineral producing areas, Africa, but almost no interest in India. So while where it was needed, the relationship grew, and of course the most pressing need was peace and stability or peace and tranquility in the border areas, leading to the two agreements on peace and tranquility and confidence building measures. In a broader understanding, both countries actually fell behind. And one of the reasons why China miscalculated after our nuclear tests, and I write about this in detail in another book I wrote called The Long Game, How the Chinese Negotiate with India, is because the level of expertise in India was so poor that they were unable to see a new India that was emerging. All they saw was a country riven by caste, religion, ethnicity, poverty. Of course, they forgot that a new reform and opening up had begun. A new middle class was emerging. A younger generation was not carrying the baggage of the 1962 conflict. There were a large number of Indians who were educated abroad and coming back with all the information technology that the West had to offer to set up our own industries. And that we had a diaspora as big as China, which could raise enough money abroad, even if the West sanctioned us after the nuclear tests. I remember very distinctly we had something called the Resurgent India Bonds, which Government of India floated, some $10 billion worth. It was subscribed in 3 days, just 3 days, by overseas Indians. That was our capacity to raise money abroad. So, and I think because China did not have good enough knowledge, it dug itself into a hole on the nuclear issue from which it ultimately had to climb out with no help from anybody else. So the point I'm getting at is that while there was progress on some issues, the lack of interest that each had in the other, and it was much more in the case of China than us, led to a gap in other areas. And this gap widened by 2010 because then you had a situation where China grew much faster than India. Economically, it went from a 1:2 ratio in the year 2000 to a 1:4 ratio by 2010. Consequentially, its military power grew, its diplomatic influence increased. And my sense is that they assumed that India would never catch up. Because if China just kept growing at 10% and India grew even at 6 to 7%, because we were growing at 6 to 7%, the gap would grow. And that there was no compulsion, therefore, for them to compromise. I think they also assumed that India would not have the capability for a geopolitical backlash. And as a result, I think there was a sense on the Chinese side that if they could just keep the relationship with India going without addressing any of India's concerns, that would be okay for them, because all they needed was to ensure some degree of stability on their vulnerable southwestern border. I think they miscalculated there. But this is why I say that, we had a very strange relationship. It was nonetheless, in areas where we collaborated, a very productive one as well. It did give 25 years of peace and tranquility on the border. It did lead to economic growth or relationship and commercial relations. And it did encourage and allow India to have greater diplomatic space globally as well. So there were positive advantages, but there were also negative side effects from this.
Karthik? Thank you so much, Bhaskar. I have a couple of questions. I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about in the 1990s, during the period, how did the Chinese view the United States? Did they see them? Did they see the U.S. as a military threat? Was it an ideological threat? Was it an economic threat? And I ask this question because around that time in Washington, there was a lot of hope that China could be further integrated into the international order. It could compel China to share more burdens in terms of global governance. And China could become as a more responsible stakeholder, right? Was that driven because of the events that were happening in China at that time, those sentiments? And so I'm just wondering what that relationship was like and how they regarded each other during those very critical years from, say, 91 to 2000 or so. And the second question I have is, with some of the points that you were listing during that period of, there was a lot of political decentralization and relaxation of political controls, but it looks like there was also a lot of economic concentration going on, right? Particularly with the SOEs. There was a dramatic rise in the number of SOEs and their role in the Chinese economy, and using the SOEs to essentially transform China's infrastructure and its own development, and some of the problems with which China is still facing today. So it would be great if you can also share and talk a little bit more about the SOEs in that context.
Sure.
Thanks.
When I was researching this book and the first one, the conclusion I drew was that the United States has always been seen as an existential threat by the Communist Party. If you look at statements and writings of Mao Zedong in the 1950s, and a very interesting one is the memoirs of Po Yi-po, the father of Po Xilai. He speaks of a speech that Mao Zedong gave to the cadres in 1957 or 58, I can't recall the exact year, where he said that the United States intends to subvert the Chinese Communist Party by peaceful means. He was using John Foster Dulles' words, peaceful evolution, and that we need to guard against this. In fact, his instruction to the leading cadres was that all of you must take an English-Chinese dictionary and read it word for word to understand what American intentions are. Now, this view continues right until the present time. And whether it is Deng or his successors or Xi Jinping, the view that the United States is intent on subverting the party's rule over China has never diminished in the Chinese calculus. It doesn't surface during the period of Deng, Chiang, and Hu because, as I said, they needed Western capital and technology to reform China and to really build the economy. So during this period, that sense that the United States is an existential threat goes subterranean. But if you were to read Deng's speeches immediately after the Tiananmen incident, including his talk with Richard Nixon, as well as with a couple of others, he very directly alludes to the US hand in the Tiananmen crisis. In one case, he actually says, you are waging a world war without gun smoke. In another case, he says, we know that you have helped people, the demonstrations against China. So in a sense, this is an indicator of what he thought. But he also realized if he allowed the rest of the party to think the same way, then he was only building up opposition to the reform. It would be grist to the mill of those who in any case felt that there was westernization taking place, bourgeois liberalization taking place, and that it is better to distance from the United States. So for those 20 years, I think the foreign policy of Deng and his successors was very skillful. They convinced the West that it was in their interest for the party to continue, and that if they made the concessions immediately on economic and other in other areas, economic, commercial, technological, and so on, there would be a payoff subsequently for the West. Now, in a particular chapter in this book called "Playing the West," I think they very much played the West, but I think the West also got played at, because it was quite evident to people as to what the Chinese were doing. But the West had convinced itself that it could transform China. And I quote a speech that President Clinton gave in 2001 at Johns Hopkins University when he tried to sell the WTO. And in this book, I show that I take his statement sentence by sentence, and it is really surprising that every single sentence that he said was proved to be wrong within 10 years. He said there would be that they would address the trade deficit. It grew manifold. He said no jobs, that there would be many more jobs for Americans, but actually there was an outflow of jobs. He said that we would democratize China. Nothing of that sort happened. He said that Chinese efforts to regulate the internet would not work. Well, they have been able to build firewalls. So practically everything he said about China was wrong. And I think that is the cleverness of the leadership, that they allowed the Americans to believe what they wanted to believe and secured their objective. I think under the current leadership, they believe that there is a structural problem in the United States when it comes to China, that because of China's economic successes, I'm not necessarily saying that this is true, I'm saying that the Chinese believe that because of their economic successes, their technological advancements, their military capacities, the United States now sees them as a rival or a threat, or as the latest national defense strategy says, a pacing challenge. But the one point I do want to leave you with, because I think this is important, is I think we tend to attribute to Trump this whole approach of decoupling, which is at the heart of the China-US rivalry. But I want to submit that it is actually a process that Xi Jinping began and not Trump. Long before Trump was the president of the United States, after all, what is the Belt and Road Initiative? It is an effort to build an alternative trading hubs and spokes. What is the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank and the New Development Bank? They are alternative to the Bretton Woods institutions. What is PayTo? It is an alternative to the GPS. What is Union Pay? What is WeChat? What is Alipay? Why are you not allowing MasterCard and Visa card to operate? All these were done before Trump became the president of the United States. So we need to understand that selectively the decoupling has begun much earlier than Trump. On the US side, Trump has exacerbated it, but Xi Jinping has continued doing it on the Chinese side as well. Their interests are that wherever they have an advantage, they will, or where they have a vulnerability, they will secure that advantage or vulnerability. Where it suits them to cooperate with the other side, they will cooperate. And I don't see this gap closing. I see it widening in the time to come. And therefore, I think it is now becoming easier for the Chinese to talk of the Americans as an existential threat. They haven't yet used those words, But anybody reading the 20th Party Congress document, where it talks of containment, suppression, it's obvious as to which country they are referring to. I don't think they believe any other country has the capacity to contain or suppress them, other than the United States. Sorry, what was the second? Yes, the SOEs, yes. The genius of Jiang Zemin was that he let go of the small and medium SOEs, which were privatized, and kept the larger ones. I think the objective was twofold. First, to convince the population that they were not fundamentally deviating from the idea of socialism in one country, that the means of production was still largely state-controlled. But secondly, also that by keeping state control over the larger factories and the larger production facilities, they could actually direct that economic effort to their objectives. And that objective was infrastructure building. Unlike, for instance, in the case of India, where the private sector was very substantial during the same period. And the private sector had its own priorities. You could not demand of the private sector that they must build high-speed rail or highways or ports if there was greater profit to be made in consumer electronics or textiles or any other sector. And therefore, I think it was a very clever mix of privatizing the smaller ones so that you had the inflow of capital, technology, and competition while keeping control of the larger ones. The problem, of course, as it happened, was evident by the end of 2010, was that the private sector itself had become powerful. And it was powerful not just in economic terms, but in terms of its capacity to influence politics. Now, this is not new. In practically every country in the world, business has a role in politics and sometimes influences politics. Therefore, I think when the current leader has come to power, he has instituted policies which are intended to re-emphasize the state-owned sector and as a way of deleveraging the private sector, because he sees parts of the private sector as challenging the authority of the party. Again, this is not a new concept. At the turn of the 20th century, this is what Theodore Roosevelt also did. What was the antitrust law? He broke up Rockefeller, Standard Oil. He broke up John Pierpont Morgan's control of the railways because they could actually challenge the presidency. So in a sense, while we are all surprised at what Xi Jinping is doing, I think there is a certain thought behind it. I'm not saying that what he's doing is right or wrong. Only time will prove that. But I think what he is trying to address is a potential political problem by private corporations which have the funds and means to influence politics. And therefore, he is giving greater stress to state-owned enterprises. I think that per se it's not a bad idea, but given all the rest that he's doing, I still feel on balance that my own hypothesis that the reassertion of controls and the reassertion of centrality and so on will impact the Chinese economy in the medium term.
Amitendo?
Sure. Do you want to take?
No, I'm okay. Thank you so much, Ambassador, I wanted to touch upon something very contemporary, and this is the zero COVID strategy of China. Now, what I'm trying to understand, and this is a bit of a mystery, to all of us, and you very clearly articulated the structure of the Chinese establishment's thinking, the emphasis on economy, the economic returns. Now, what is becoming very obvious by now, and this is not just the way the external consultants or the Western analysts are presenting, but even the internal reports, the work reports that have been submitted at the NPC and the CPC are making it very clear that the economic costs of the zero COVID strategy are pretty high. And after the 20th CPC, there have been some token announcements of some relaxations, but on ground it seems that there's hardly much. Now, why do you think that there is such an emphasis on the persistence of this policy while the rest of the world has taken a different position. And do you see any giving up on the policy in the days to come? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think all countries reacted with extreme measures when the COVID pandemic hit in 2020. Whether it was China, India, the United States, or the rest of the world, including Singapore, all activity came to a halt, basically. The difference, I believe, was that whereas all of us reacted essentially to a public health crisis, the Chinese leadership had a political motivation in putting into place their COVID policy, because they claimed through 2020 and 2021 that their political management was better than the rest of the world. In a sense, it was a validation, a legitimization of the Chinese Communist Party's activity as compared to the activity of almost any other foreign government. And this was and of course, when we talk of foreign governments, they don't compare themselves with India or Singapore. They compare themselves with the United States and Western Europe, or European Union. And on two counts, they thought that they had come out the winner. Firstly, there was practically no COVID in China, and Chinese were living a relatively normal life within the bubble, while all of us were masking and going through a difficult time. And therefore, they thought that their system had managed COVID better than advanced Western democracies. The second is because they were able to provide assistance to others in terms of PPE kits or vaccines or what have you, which the West was slow in providing. And therefore, the view was establishing that their political system had reacted more favorably in giving international public goods when the West couldn't. And both these successes were identified with the individual and the leader. President Xi Jinping had done this, and he had shown the Chinese people that they were better off with his policy than those if you had lived in a Western democracy, and that China's image was better than the image of the Western democracies in the rest of the world. Now, having associated the individual and the leader with this policy, it has become increasingly difficult for them to climb out of it. When, after 2 years, if they suddenly open up, you have that massive wave of infection and fatalities which all the rest of the world had to go through. And to that extent, therefore, when it is the leadership which is at stake, when it is their reputation and when it is their, frankly, continuance in power, it is now becoming difficult to climb off the back of the tiger. Because as we have seen recently, they have indicated some flexibility in their zero COVID policy, but today Beijing is practically under lockdown, and so are a number of other cities, because of course, all that they were able to do in those 2 years was in fact contain themselves within the bubble. The moment the bubble bursts, you aren't any more immune than others from infection. Now, I frankly think that at least until March, and when he is securely in position as the president, although that's a foregone conclusion, they will have to try a switching on, switching off strategy on zero COVID, in the hope that by then some amount of herd immunity develops. But if it doesn't, I foresee them having a significant a challenge within their own population. After all, how do you explain to the population that even after all this, you're the only country in the world which is closed? And one point I do want to mention here, because as I started by saying that, in India we either sensationalize or demonize the Chinese with, and we don't think we can ever catch up, is really seeing the way India handled this crisis as compared to China. After the Delta wave, the massive vaccination program that took place, and it is a population as large as China, so it's just the only country that can be compared to China. The massive vaccination that took place, the massive scale up of the health programs that took place, the way in which the government then reacted in trying to bring COVID under control, which has led to all restrictions as of yesterday being removed. Yesterday, the last few restrictions were removed, including India saying that non-vaccinated people can come into India provided you do an RT-PCR test. Is, I think, a success when you don't associate individuals with your political decisions. It was the government which took that decision, and there was no ownership claimed of it. In China, unfortunately, the party has claimed ownership of what has happened, and I think they're now facing that challenge. So, in a sense, I think in the next few months, there will be comparisons between the way in which India and China have handled this crisis. And it will redound badly on the Chinese, in my opinion. And I think this should, in fact, be compared, because too often there is an unfavorable comparison. But this is really a case where one country has demonstrated substantial success and the other is still struggling to get out of the zero COVID policy.
Yes, Ganesh.
Hi, I'm Ganesh Kudesia in the South Asian Studies program. My question, I really enjoyed your book because it gives a sense of conjunctures, different phases, different trajectories. And very, very significantly, you have given us a good sense of the foundational period of 1990, 2010, that sort of period. My question is really about what was Xi Jinping doing in that period? What was he invested in the two pillars that you said are the basis of China's rise, which is relaxation of controls and decentralization? Was he invested in these two policies? What was his own political trajectory? And are there sharp discontinuities that we may expect presently in the current regime from moving away from those? Yeah, thank you.
I think the current leader is one who has stayed below the radar despite being in political life for 40 years. And I find a surprising continuity in the way that Xi Jinping has acted. He came from the elite. His father was a high-ranking communist, and he had connections. He was perhaps the only or one of the very few children of high-ranking leaders who opted to leave Beijing in 1983 and serve in the provinces for close to 25 years. It would have been much easier for him to stay in Beijing and benefit from his father's and his family's connections. But I think, the point I want to make is, I think we should not view his political views cynically. He is somebody who perhaps believed that by going to work in rural areas, in the poorer parts of China, in the less urbanized parts of the country, he was perhaps rendering some kind of a service or gaining experience. By that, I'm not suggesting that he is not a die-hard communist. He is as dyed-in-the-wool as they come. But I think that the trajectory he took is something that is reflected in his life today. And therefore, he used that decentralization, that competition, to do programs that he felt would benefit rural areas and subsequently in urban areas in Fuzhou and in Fujian province and then Zhejiang province and in Shanghai. I'm sure he learnt along the way what the good and bad effects are. And certainly he would have seen corruption at very close quarters because China was very corrupt by the year 2000 or 2001. And the scale of corruption there is manifold the scale of corruption in democracies, simply because there is no public scrutiny, there is no media, there's no parliament, there's no public opinion. So you can get away with much more than you can in a democracy. And I think all this influenced the way he thought. When he came to Beijing in 2007, he was vice president, he was the secretary in the party secretariat, he was the heir apparent to the throne, as it were. And he would have therefore been part of the policy making as well. So I think it is not as if he did a sharp turn in 2012. I think his ideas evolved organically from 1983 onwards. What he saw in the provinces, what he saw in the cities, what he saw as governor and party secretary in key parts of China, and then as vice president. What I find interesting is that he never actually displayed his views to anybody. or in any manner challenged the leadership of the day. And in this book, towards the end, I contrast him with the other rising star in Chinese politics, Po Xilai. So and I mean, since I had the occasion to meet both of them quite often, I mean, you could see the contrast. One was flamboyant, spoke English, wanted to impress, wore the sharpest suits. The other was completely self-effacing. You never, he didn't say very much, he didn't talk very much, he appeared modest. One had very strong views, the other simply almost read out the party line. One of them lived a lifestyle clearly beyond the means of a member of the Communist Party. The other, you don't find any gossip about Xi Jinping prior to this. So it was a sharp contrast. And therefore, I think he was able to climb up the ladder because he didn't come to anybody's notice. I mean, you can call it cunning, you can call it wiliness, you can call it good politics, but I think he played his cards well. And he is simply now unfolding policies that he has, I think, thought about quite deeply. Now, I'm not saying they're right. And I think that when you have an echo chamber, when you begin to rely only on a few people, you make quite serious mistakes. But what I'm saying is that what he's doing now is consistent with his whole life. It's not something he suddenly woke up on in November 2012 and decided to do.
That brings us to the close of this discussion. But, sorry, I should say the close of the official session, but I'm sure the discussion can carry on beyond as well. Please join me in thanking Mr. Gokhale for not only the book, but the discussion and the thoughts that he shared with us as well. Thank you for joining us today, Mr.
Thank
Gokhale.
you.
On behalf of ISAS, we would like to extend our thanks to Mr. Gokhale and Dr. Sevia for an engaging and insightful session. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you at our upcoming events. Have a good afternoon.